Last week saw the release of the second season of The Rings of Power. Now, we didn't get a screener with enough notice to run any coverage of the show itself, so this seems like as good a time as any to talk about the state of the modern streaming landscape. The first season of The Rings of Power premiered 2 years ago. It was infamously the most expensive season of television ever produced. Now, streaming services are notoriously cagey with the information they provide, but reports place the budget of the whole season somewhere between $715 million and $1 billion for 8 episodes.
$1 billion.
It was, in many ways, the height of the streaming boom, a demonstration of the opulence and the decadence that marked this chapter of Hollywood history. That said, there is something poetic in using The Lord of the Rings as a framework for this discussion. The Lord of the Rings is, at its core, a story of how seemingly wise leaders were seduced and beguiled by the promise of power and glory, only to find themselves betrayed and their kingdoms thrown into disarray. More than that, The Lord of the Rings is itself a nostalgic invocation of a fantasy world slowly fading into memory, a magical world that never really existed. So this week, we're going to take a look at how the studio has lost any sense of elf control, how their spending dwarfed all reason, and how the streaming bubble mounted its own doom. I know that some people don't like the terrible puns that open these videos, so I'll just hope that you don't go sour on me.
Gentlemen, let's get down to business.
Streaming services are, conceptually, a great idea, particularly for older and established Hollywood studios with extensive back catalogs of quality content. It's quite appealing to be able to pay a small amount of money to have access to every Disney film or every television show that aired on CBS. There's clearly an appeal to this.
Honey, I'm home.
A lot of the traffic to streaming services is driven by existing shows and movies. Nielsen's data suggests that the most successful shows on streaming last year, Suits, Bluey, NCIS, Grey's Anatomy, were all titles that originated outside the streaming ecosphere, far outperforming native shows like Ted Lasso or The Night Agent. The same is true for movies. If you look at the most streamed movies for last year, it's clear that the kids have spoken, and they want Mo, Anna. So, how did we end up in a situation where these services are paying absurd amounts of money for new shows that aren't capable of attracting enough subscribers to remain viable? The answer is quite simply Netflix. When Netflix was founded and when it transitioned into streaming, it was able to license content quickly and cheaply from all the major studios. Companies like Warner's or Disney had no idea what streaming was worth, so Netflix was able to secure an impressive library at a reasonable cost. However, Netflix was always very canny. The company realized quite early on that once the traditional studios realized what it was doing and how much money it was making, they would start to silo their own content, in the hopes of both building their own direct-to-consumer service and starving their competitor of content. So, Netflix needed to build its own library to insulate itself from what it saw as an unavoidable streaming war. Indeed, the service got rather lucky in terms of timing, taking out massive loans at a time of historically low interest rates, allowing it to spend lavishly without building insurmountable debt. As a result, Netflix was able to produce high-quality content starring recognizable actors from brand-name directors. This set a precedent. Any company hoping to compete with Netflix had to do the same. For traditional studios, this meant investing heavily in established brands, with Disney, for example, effectively downgrading Marvel and Star Wars from exclusively theatrical franchises that made literally billions of dollars to lost leaders designed to promote their own streaming service.
Unless the world pays us a hefty ransom.
At the height of the pandemic, Warner's decided to send their biggest blockbusters straight to HBO Max as part of Project Popcorn. Still, for a couple of years, it was wild. Disney reportedly spent $25 million per episode on some of its Marvel streaming shows. Netflix spent $30 million per episode of Stranger Things. Initially, there was some hope that this model would be sustainable. After all, the streaming wars coincided with the global pandemic, which meant that a lot of families were locked indoors with nothing to do, and with more disposable income than before, and so represented a literal captive audience for these services.
And hold the world hostage. Good.
If you were Disney or Warner's, this looked like a viable model. But in true Lord of the Rings fashion, they were all deceived. There's a real question about who is actually watching any of this stuff beyond culture vultures like yours truly. But leaked documents suggest that only 37% of the viewers who started The Rings of Power made it to the end of the 8-episode season. Increasingly, services have begun to game metrics, with Disney Plus, for example, releasing every episode of Echo and the Bear simultaneously in the hopes of making the streaming charts and generating conversation. It's all a bit illusory.
I'm the boss. Need the info.
Ultimately, the thing about bubbles is that they burst. Instead of treating the pandemic as a perfect storm of circumstances designed to artificially inflate their subscriptions, these services assumed that the good times would keep on rolling, that this was a launching pad to complete domination. However, 2 years ago, it would become clear that this was not a sustainable approach. In April 2022, when Netflix reported a loss of subscribers for the first time in over a decade, the market panicked, and the biggest streaming service experienced the Great Netflix Correction. By the time The Rings of Power premiered a couple of months later, the mood had shifted. The services entered panic mode.
Shit.
The major studios woke up to reality, discovering that all is changed, utterly. In October 2022, the average American household was willing to spend $135 per month on streaming. By March 2024, that figure had dropped by more than half to simply $61 per month. In January 2022, the average American household paid for 4.7 streaming services. By August 2024, that figure had dropped to 2.9 services per household. As such, there was blood in the water. The pool of potential customers was shrinking rapidly. So the services were faced with two ways to minimize losses and increase earnings. They had to both reduce spending dramatically and extract greater value from fewer existing subscribers. Studios cut costs in a number of ways. Most obviously, they began removing material from these services. Under CEO and Captain Planet villain David Zaslav, Warner Discovery opted simply not to release movies such as Batgirl and a new Scooby-Doo film, because they would be more valuable to the company as tax write-offs than as streaming releases. This set a precedent, clearing the way for Disney to start removing already released content from its own service, including shows like Willow and movies like Rosalind. Crater, for example, disappeared from the service just 48 days after it was released. In desperate need of cash flow, these services stopped siloing their intellectual property. It was more important to get a return on investment than it was to try and starve Netflix. Just a year after declaring that Paramount Plus was, quote, the home of Star Trek, the second season of Star Trek Prodigy premiered on Netflix. Ironically, this destroys one of the central appeals of the streaming service as a library. What's the point in having a Disney Plus subscription if you don't have access to the Disney Vault? Why would you pay for Paramount Plus if you can't watch all of Star Trek in one place? In order to wring even more value from less content, the release model itself became more canny. Pay attention to when your favorite streaming show drops. Disney, for example, will often release its big shows spread across financial quarters, premiering at the end of one quarter and ending at the start of another. This is a way to retain subscribers when publishing quarterly reports so as not to startle investors. Even Netflix, a huge proponent of the binge model, has gotten in on the act, setting seasons of Stranger Things, The Witcher, and Cobra Kai across financial quarters, stretching the value of these projects just a little further. And of course, there was an upside. Studios came to appreciate the value of the traditional release models. Projects that had been announced for streaming, such as Alien Romulus or the new Moana movie from Disney, were given theatrical releases, where they would make more money than they would premiering on a streaming service. Shows that had initially been intended for streaming, like for example the Penguin Show or the new Harry Potter series at Warner's, moved back to television. Of course, there's a legitimate question about whether this is too little too late. Have studios already conditioned audiences to expect these sorts of films on streaming, and not to go to cinemas? More broadly, the number of original shows dropped substantially in 2023, both for Netflix specifically and for the industry at large. This was partly due to the writers and actors strikes in the second half of 2023, but it was also inseparable from the streaming wars. Those were, after all, the Netflix strike. Even the companies with the deepest pockets, such as Apple and Amazon, have indicated a desire to pull back from their spending on streaming content.
Throw me a frickin' bone here.
This brings us to the other way of extracting value from a shrinking market. The higher tier plans from all the major streaming providers have increased in price significantly over the past few years. However, the companies are also double dipping. Though Netflix had promised as recently as 2018 that they would, quote, never allow advertising on the platform, it has begun aggressively rolling out an ad-supported tier. Amazon and Disney have followed suit. If you aren't willing to pay more to these companies directly, these services will find other ways to monetize you.
Let this be a reminder to you all that this organization will not tolerate failure.
Now, there is a sense that this triage is working, at least to some extent. The companies have at least slowed the bleeding. This quarter, Disney's streaming turned a profit for the first time, netting the company a neat $47 million, or almost an hour of She-Hulk. Of course, that's a pittance when compared to the $11 billion that the company's sunk into the model so far. Meanwhile, David Zaslav earns huge bonuses at Warner's Discovery for increasing cash flow and reducing debt, with no eye to long-term sustainability. So, we arrive here at the second season premiere of the most expensive television series ever made, and there's no real buzz or excitement. It feels more like a wake than a party. The Rings of Power stands as a monument to the excess of the streaming wars, a nostalgic reminder of a fantasy world built on illusions and lies. Then again, there was always a nostalgia to Middle-earth. Tolkien was writing about an imagined England fading into memory. So, I guess, at least this all has a nice ring to it. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.